In the heart of nowhere, where silence reigns and shadows speak, lies a forgotten relic of the past. WNSR radio station shut down decades ago after a series of unexplainable tragedies. They called it cursed. Some claimed the voices never left, that the airwaves still echo their pain.
Eric Malone thought it was just another gig, a simple broadcast to revive an old legend. But as the signal reached the airwaves, something else answered. Good evening, listeners. This is Eric Malone broadcasting live from, well, let's just say the creepiest place I've ever been.
Trapped in the static, surrounded by the voices of the damned, will he survive the night, or will he become the next host to join the cursed frequency? The isolated broadcast, streaming now.
The airwaves crackled with anticipation. A voice, smooth as velvet, filled the darkness. It belonged to Eric Malone, a man born for the night. His charisma resonated, weaving tales and spinning dreams for the insomniacs and night owls. Listeners tuned in, not just for the music, but for the comfort of his voice. Eric thrived in the dimly lit studio, headphones his only companion. He felt most alive when the world slept, his words painting pictures in the minds of his listeners. He knew the power of radio, its ability to transport, to terrify, to console. But even he, a seasoned veteran of the airwaves, couldn't have anticipated the night that awaited him. The phone rang, shattering the quiet hum of the studio. It was his boss, his voice unusually high-pitched, almost frantic. He had a proposition, an opportunity too lucrative to refuse. A one-time gig, a hefty sum for a single night's work. Eric listened, skepticism tinging his curiosity as his boss explained the details. WNSR. The name hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. WNSR, the abandoned radio station on the outskirts of town. Legends swirled around it like fog on a moonless night. But the urgency in his boss's voice planted a seed of doubt in his mind. WNSR had a history, a dark and troubled past that clung to its decaying walls like ivy. It had once been a thriving hub, a voice that boomed across the airwaves. But something had happened, something sinister that had silenced its song. The details were always vague, lost in a haze of speculation and fear. Some whispered of a fire, a catastrophic event that had claimed the lives of the station's staff. Others spoke of a rogue DJ, driven mad by his own ambition, who had unleashed something evil into the airwaves. Whatever the truth, one thing was certain. WNSR was considered cursed, a place where darkness lingered, and the air thrummed with unspoken horrors. Despite his growing unease, Eric found himself drawn to the challenge. The money was too good to pass up, and a primal part of him urged him forward. Armed with his trusty microphone and a knot of apprehension, he embarked on the long, desolate drive to WNSR. The road narrowed, twisting and turning like a serpent through the dense woodland. The silence was broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional cry of a nightbird. With each passing mile, the air grew colder, heavier, as if the weight of the station's history was pressing down on him. The headlights cut through the oppressive darkness, illuminating the skeletal silhouette of WNSR. It loomed before him, a decaying monument to a bygone era. The once bright facade was now a canvas of peeling paint and creeping vines. Windows, like vacant eyes, stared back at him, reflecting the ghostly glow of the moon. He parked the car, the crunch of gravel under the tires loud in the stillness. A gust of wind, cold and mournful, swept through the trees, carrying with it the scent of decay and the faintest whisper of static. Eric stepped out of the car, his breath catching in his throat. The air was heavy, thick with an unseen presence. He was committed now, his curiosity outweighing his fear. With a deep breath, he slammed the car door shut, the sound echoing in the stillness like a gunshot. He turned towards the station, his footsteps slow and measured as he approached the entrance. The front door, its paint blistered and cracked, hung precariously from its hinges. He pushed the door open, the rusty hinges groaning in protest. He pulled out his flashlight, its beam cutting through the oppressive darkness, illuminating the interior in a series of jarring flashes. The air inside was stagnant, thick with dust motes dancing in the pale beam of his flashlight. Cobwebs draped the hallways like macabre decorations, and the silence was broken only by the sound of his own breathing. He moved deeper into the station, each step echoing in the cavernous space. The station was a labyrinth of hallways and rooms, stripped bare and echoing with the ghosts of broadcasts past. He found his way to the control room, drawn by the faint glow of a single bare bulb hanging from the ceiling. A microphone, its once gleaming surface now dull and pitted, stood sentinel, as if waiting for the voice that would awaken it from its slumber. He ran his fingers over the dusty surface of the mixing board, a strange sense of familiarity washing over him. He flipped a switch, the ancient equipment sputtering to life with a low hum. The red light of the microphone flickered on, casting a malevolent glow on the room. Taking a deep breath, he leaned into the microphone, his voice a low tremor in the silence. "Good evening, night owls," he began, his voice echoing strangely in the empty room. "This is Eric Malone, coming to you live from the legendary WNSR. Tonight," he continued, his voice gaining confidence, "we'll unravel the mysteries surrounding this place." He couldn't shake the feeling that he was not alone, that unseen eyes were watching him. Eric settled into the broadcast, his initial nervousness giving way to the familiar rhythm of his craft. He wove tales of the station's past, embellishing the known facts with his own brand of storytelling. He spoke of the DJs who had graced the airwaves, their voices now silenced, their stories lost to time. But as he spoke, a strange sensation washed over him. It was a feeling of being watched, of being observed by unseen eyes. He could hear the faintest of whispers, soft and sibilant, like the rustling of dry leaves. He tried to ignore it, to focus on his broadcast, but the feeling persisted. He continued his monologue, his voice a steady beacon in the darkness. He spoke of the station's sudden closure, the mystery that shrouded its final broadcast. He recounted the local legends, the whispers of strange occurrences, of voices heard late at night on frequencies long since abandoned. And then he heard it, a sound, faint at first but unmistakable, a tapping, rhythmic and insistent, coming from the wall behind him. He paused, his blood turning to ice in his veins. "Must be the old pipes," he muttered to himself, his voice sounding small and uncertain in the stillness of the room. He decided to play a music track, to fill the silence that had become suddenly oppressive. He reached for a stack of old records, their labels faded and peeling, relics from a bygone era. As the music filled the air, a wave of relief washed over him. He glanced at the soundboard, watching the needles dance in time with the music, and that's when he noticed it. A strange waveform flickered across the monitor, a series of rhythmic pulses, out of sync with the music. It was like nothing he had ever seen before, a chaotic jumble of peaks and valleys. The music continued to play, oblivious to the strange anomaly on the monitor. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. He tried to rationalize it, to attribute it to faulty equipment, to his overactive imagination. But deep down, a primal fear gnawed at his gut, whispering to him that he was treading on dangerous ground. He decided to reach out, to break the fourth wall, to seek solace in the shared experience of his listeners. "Okay, folks, he said, his voice betraying a hint of nervousness for the first time. "Something strange is happening here. If you're hearing anything out of the ordinary, anything at all, let me know." The silence from the other end of the line was deafening. Silence hung heavy in the air, broken only by the rhythmic hum of the equipment and the frantic beating of Eric's heart. He waited, every nerve ending on high alert, for any sign, any indication that his plea had reached someone, anyone. Then, through the static, faint and distant, he heard it. A voice, thin and reedy like a whisper carried on the wind. It spoke his name, a single word, drawn out, distorted, barely audible above the white noise. Eric. It sent chills down his spine, a cold dread gripping his heart. He was not alone. The whispers grew stronger, multiplying, weaving themselves into the fabric of the broadcast. They spoke in fragments, disjointed words and phrases, their meaning obscured by the static and the passage of time. "Leave!" they hissed, their voices a chorus of despair. "Turn back!" They seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere at once, emanating from the very walls of the station itself. The temperature in the room plummeted, a bone-chilling cold that seeped into his bones. He tried to speak, to regain control of the broadcast, but his voice caught in his throat, choked by the growing terror that threatened to consume him. The lights in the control room flickered, casting long, grotesque shadows that danced menacingly on the walls. For a brief moment, the room was plunged into darkness, the silence complete and absolute. Then, as the light sputtered back to life, he saw it. A photograph, hanging on the wall opposite him. A photograph he hadn't noticed before. It was a black and white image, faded and yellowed with age, of a man sitting at a microphone, his face caught in a grimace of pure terror. He stared at the photograph, his blood turning to ice in his veins. The man's eyes seemed to follow him, burning into his soul with an intensity that defied explanation. He had a feeling, a growing certainty, that the man in the photograph held the key to the horrors unfolding around him. He stumbled towards the photograph, his hand reaching out to touch the cold glass of the frame. As he drew closer, he noticed a caption, scrawled beneath the image in faded ink. It read, "Paul Wilkins, 1987. Final broadcast. Paul Wilkins, the DJ who had vanished without a trace, his final broadcast ending in a blood-curdling scream." He stared at the photograph, at the terror etched on Paul Wilkins' face, and a cold realization washed over him. He was not the first to be drawn into the station's web of horror, and unless he could find a way to break free, he would not be the last. The station was a predator, feeding on the ambition, the curiosity of those foolish enough to enter its domain. He stumbled back from the photograph, his heart pounding. He had to escape the suffocating darkness. His legs felt like lead, frozen by an unseen force, trapped, just like Paul Wilkins before him. The whispers intensified, swirling around him. "You can't escape," they hissed. "You're one of us now." Panic swelled, threatening to consume him. He had to regain control, had to find a way out of this nightmare. His eyes darted around the control room, searching for an escape, a weapon, anything to break the hold the station had on him. He stumbled towards the desk, knocking over a pile of old scripts, their yellowed pages scattering across the floor like fallen leaves. He yanked open a drawer, his heart pounding in his chest. It was filled with cassette tapes, their labels barely visible beneath a thick layer of dust. He rummaged through them, his trembling fingers brushing against the cold plastic. Each tape felt heavy with unspoken stories, with the weight of the station's dark history. He had a feeling, a desperate hope, that somewhere among these forgotten relics lay a clue, an answer, a way to break free from the grip of WNSR. One tape, tucked away in the back corner of the drawer, caught his eye. Its label, handwritten in faded ink, sent a chill down his spine. It simply read, "Play me." The words seemed to pulsate with an eerie energy, beckoning him, daring him to unleash the secrets contained within. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the tape, his gut screaming at him to leave it be. But the whispers, now a constant presence in his mind, urged him on. "Listen," they hissed. "He understands." He tried to warn them. He couldn't be sure if the whispers were guiding him towards salvation or deeper into the abyss, but he was out of options. With trembling hands, he picked up the tape, its plastic casing cold and damp against his skin. He inserted the tape into the player, the mechanism clicking shut with a finality that made his heart skip a beat. He hit play, and a wave of static erupted from the speakers, sending a jolt of adrenaline through his system. Then a voice, weak and trembling, cut through the white noise. "This is Paul Wilkins," the voice began, its tone laced with a terror that transcended time. "If you're hearing this, you've already made a mistake." Eric's blood ran cold. It was him, the man from the photograph, his voice a ghostly echo from beyond the grave. "The station," Paul's voice continued, each word a struggle. "It doesn't let you leave. The more you broadcast, the stronger they get. They'll take your voice, your soul." The words hung in the air, heavy with a despair that was palpable. Paul Wilkins had been where he was now, trapped, consumed by the entity that haunted WNSR, and he had tried to warn others, to break the cycle of horror. Eric listened intently, hanging on to every word, every inflection in Paul's voice, as if his very survival depended on it. But just as suddenly as it had begun, the message ended, cut off mid-sentence by a surge of static that made him wince. Then, a sound that chilled him to his core, a sound that seemed to claw its way out of the speakers and into the very fabric of the room, a scream, raw and primal, filled with an agony that transcended words. It was a scream that spoke of unimaginable terror, of the complete and utter annihilation of the soul. Eric recoiled from the speakers, his hands flying to his ears in a futile attempt to block out the sound, but it was no use. The scream seemed to reverberate through his very being, shaking him to his core. The tape player, as if possessed by a malevolent entity of its own, ejected the cassette with a violent force. It clattered to the floor, spinning silently amidst the scattered pages of forgotten scripts. The control room fell silent, the only sound the faint hum of the equipment and the frantic thump of Eric's heart against his ribs. He sat frozen in his chair, his body trembling, his mind reeling from what he had just heard. Paul Wilkins' warning echoed in his mind. "They'll take your voice, your soul." He glanced at the microphone, its cold metallic surface gleaming under the dim studio lights. He could feel its pull, its seductive power beckoning him closer. He knew with a certainty that chilled him to the bone that he was in grave danger, that the entity that had claimed Paul Wilkins had set its sights on him. He was trapped, caught in a web of horror of his own making, and time was running out. He scrambled to his feet, adrenaline surging through his veins. He had to get out, had to escape the suffocating confines. He lunged for the door, but it wouldn't budge. He threw his weight against the door, but it wouldn't give. Panic surged through him as he realized the station was alive. The room seemed to shift, the walls closing in. The whispers, once faint and distant, now pressed in on him, a chorus of disembodied voices echoing around the control room. They slithered through the air vents, seeped from the cracks in the walls, their icy breath chilling him to the bone. They spoke his name, a sibilant hiss that sent shivers down his spine. "Eric, Eric." He covered his ears, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The whispers had burrowed their way into his mind, worming through his thoughts, amplifying his fear. They spoke of things he couldn't comprehend, of shadows and static, of voices trapped in the airwaves, forever seeking release. They spoke of Paul Wilkins, his name a mournful sigh on the wind. They recounted his torment, his descent into madness, his ultimate demise. They warned Eric that he was next, that the same fate awaited him. He was to become another voice in their chorus of the damned, his essence forever bound to the cursed frequencies of WNSR. The shadows deepened, swirling and coalescing as the whispers intensified. They took on forms, indistinct and flickering, like images on a staticky screen. Faces emerged, pale and gaunt, their eyes burning with cold, ethereal light. He recognized one, the man from the photograph, Paul Wilkins. His features were twisted in a silent scream, his eyes filled with terrible knowledge locked onto Eric's, pleading silently. Their voices, a cacophony of whispers, merged into a single chilling message. "Join us, Eric!" they chanted, their voices echoing around the control room. "Become one with the station, your voice, your essence. It belongs to us now." He felt a pull towards the microphone, a magnetic force drawing him closer. His hand, as if guided by an unseen force, reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold metallic surface. He tried to resist, to pull away, but it was no use. The station had him in its grasp, its power flowing through him, amplifying his fear, breaking down his resistance. He looked into the eyes of the spectral figures surrounding him, saw the reflection of his own terror mirrored back at him. He knew with a chilling certainty that there was no escape. He was destined to join their ranks, to become another lost soul trapped within the airwaves, his voice forever broadcasting into the void. His fingers closed around the microphone, the familiar weight strangely comforting. He felt a surge of energy, dark and powerful, coursing through his veins. His vision blurred, ghostly figures merging with the shadows. His voice crackled with static, the words not his own. Eric Malone, the voice of the night, was gone, replaced by something ancient and malevolent. The control room, once a haven of sound and stories, transformed into a suffocating cage of terror. Walls pulsed with an unseen energy, pressing inward as if the very structure conspired to crush him. The air thickened, heavy and cold, stealing the breath from his lungs. Each desperate gasp brought him closer to suffocation, his chest constricting with panic. Eric thrashed against the invisible force that bound him, a puppet fighting against its puppeteer. But his struggle was futile, his strength ebbing away with each passing moment. The whispers, now a deafening roar, mocked his plight, their laughter echoing through the room, a chilling symphony of his impending doom. He stumbled back, his hand instinctively reaching out, grasping for something, anything, to ground him in the disintegrating reality. His fingers closed around the cold, smooth surface of the microphone stand, the only familiar object in the swirling chaos that had become his world. From the depths of the swirling static that now filled the room, a figure emerged. It flickered into existence, its form coalescing from the shadows, taking on a horrifying solidity. Paul Wilkins stood before him, no longer a faded image trapped in a photograph, but a spectral being, his features etched with the eternal torment of his fate. Gone was the terror that had contorted his face in the photograph. Now, an unsettling calm settled over his features, a chilling acceptance of his eternal imprisonment within the walls of WNSR. His eyes, however, burned with a cold fire, reflecting the endless torment of his existence. "You fought it," Paul rasped, his voice a grating whisper that seemed to emanate from the depths of Eric's own skull. But it always wins. The station craves a voice, a conduit to the world. You are its latest victim. "Why?" Eric choked out, struggling against the suffocating pressure. Why me? Paul's spectral form drifted closer, the air growing colder. His ethereal hand brushed against Eric's cheek, sending a jolt of terror. "The station," Paul whispered. "It feeds on ambition. You walked willingly into its embrace." The pull toward the microphone became irresistible. His body, no longer his own, moved with a terrifying grace, drawn towards the device as if by an invisible string. He tried to resist, to fight against the force that controlled him, but it was no use. The station was in control now, its will flowing through him, bending him to its purpose. His fingers closed around the microphone, the familiar weight now a chilling reminder of his fate. He could feel the energy of the station coursing through him, amplifying his fear, twisting his thoughts into a garbled mess. His voice, when he finally spoke, was no longer his own. It was a hollow, distorted echo, imbued with the chilling essence of WNSR. "This is Eric Malone," he rasped, the words ripped from his throat, each syllable a nail hammered into the coffin of his former life. "Broadcasting forever." His final words, a desperate plea lost in the static, were not a farewell, but a warning. A message to anyone foolish enough to tune in, to anyone who dared to listen to the cursed frequencies of WNSR. "Don't listen, please don't." The lights in the control room flickered once more, plunging the space into darkness. The only sound that remained was the echo of his distorted laughter, a chilling reminder of the station's insatiable hunger. Eric Malone, the once charismatic voice of the night, was gone, his essence absorbed into the very fabric of WNSR, another voice in its eternal, haunting chorus. Dawn broke, painting the sky in hues of gray and purple, a stark contrast to the unnatural darkness that clung to WNSR. The once imposing structure now appeared skeletal in the pale light of morning, its windows like vacant eyes staring out at the empty road. The silence was deafening, broken only by the rustling of leaves and the distant cry of a lone bird. A lone police cruiser, its lights flashing a silent warning, sat parked outside the station's entrance. Eric Malone was gone, vanished without a trace. The investigation, hampered by dead ends and unanswered questions, yielded no results. Witnesses, their memories clouded by fear and the passage of time, offered conflicting accounts of strange lights and eerie sounds emanating from the station in the dead of night. But their stories, dismissed as the ramblings of superstitious minds, did little to shed light on Eric's fate. The official report, a dry and clinical document, attributed his disappearance to misadventure, the unfortunate consequence of venturing into a derelict and dangerous building. The rumors, however, whispered a different tale. A tale of a man consumed by the very entity he sought to exploit, his voice now a permanent fixture in the station's haunted symphony. The legend of WNSR, once a local ghost story, took on a more sinister life, fueled by Eric's disappearance and the lingering unease that clung to the station like a shroud. People spoke in hushed tones, their voices laced with fear, recounting tales of strange occurrences and unexplained phenomena. Late at night, when the air was thick with shadows and the world slept, some swore they could still hear Eric's voice, a ghostly echo carried on the wind. His laughter, once warm and inviting, now sent chills down their spines. Truckers reported seeing flickering lights in the abandoned building, their radios crackling with interference. Some even claimed to have seen a figure silhouetted in the station's window. Years passed, each season painting the station in a fresh coat of decay, but its hold on the local consciousness remained as strong as ever. WNSR stood as a silent sentinel on the outskirts of town, a crumbling reminder of the power of the unseen, its secrets buried deep within its decaying walls. Attempts to demolish the station, to erase its presence from the landscape, proved futile. Equipment malfunctioned, accidents plagued the demolition crews, and a sense of unease, a palpable dread, permeated the air, driving even the most hardened workers away. WNSR, it seemed, was determined to remain standing, a testament to the darkness it had embraced. And so it remained, a haunting echo of a bygone era, its voice silenced but its presence undeniable. A chilling reminder that some stories, like the static that crackled across abandoned frequencies, never truly